At 1:54 during a national network outage, a root DNS mirror began serving a top-level domain that did not exist. The zone was called .reserve. It resolved hospitals, payment systems, weather services, and emergency networks to working backup servers. Its cryptographic signature. The root mirror provides authoritative name data during international link failures. Its own files, keys, and update path are tightly controlled and independently audited. The investigation into root authority began at a hardened Internet Exchange data hall with fiber trays, root server racks, blue status LEDs, and an isolated operations console. During a fiber cut, the mirror added the DNS reserve zone and answered only for critical public services. Each record pointed to a reachable server with current data. The opening exhibit for root authority pairs the last normal maintenance entry with a pre-incident photograph of the site. In root authority, an independent review reproduced the result documented under site record without using the operational interface. Jonas Reed, the exchange's overnight reliability engineer, preserved the first local record before any reset or maintenance action. During a fiber cut, the mirror added the JOTSHIW reserve zone and answered only for critical public services. Each record pointed to a reachable server with current data. In the file for root authority, the account was checked against access control, clock records, and original instrument output. The reserve zone statement was recorded before shift change and reconciled with badge entries, calls, and handwritten notes. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous first operator statement value, separating absence from disagreement. Resolvers ask the root where a top-level domain is delegated. The mirror answers from a signed local copy and cannot invent new authority without a valid key chain. At National Internet Exchange, Sovereign DNS root mirror, the reserve zone reading, passed the safeguards intended to reject false data instead of entering through an undocumented feature. This distinction is central to root authority. The system did not merely display a value. It admitted that value as evidence. Exhibit 3 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, Sovereign DNS root mirror before it entered the final record. The first reserve zone operational log fixed the event at 1:54. During a fiber cut, the mirror added the .ia reserve zone and answered only for critical public services. Each record pointed to a reachable server with current data. At National Internet Exchange, Sovereign DNS root mirror, no warning was generated because the system classified the reading as internally valid. The reserve zone log was exported before restart, preserving counters and values the interface normally rounds away. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Investigators opened root authority with a conventional explanation. Engineers suspected emergency configuration left by a vendor. Repository history, deployment logs, and signed release packages contained no reserve zone. The first theory in the reserve zone file remained provisional until evidence could reproduce it or remove it. For root authority, investigators wrote the expected result in advance so interpretation could not be adjusted after the test. In root authority, an independent review reproduced the result documented under working hypothesis without using the operational interface. The reserve zone event was not confined to one instrument. Two isolated resolver clusters received identical answers and validated the same unknown signature. Public resolvers outside the outage did not see the domain. In root authority, agreement between separate references removed the easiest fault theory without locating a physical source. The independent reserve zone instruments use different power, clocks, sensors, and processing paths. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous independent confirmation value, separating absence from disagreement. The investigation into root authority changed when the reading produced a material consequence. The hardware security module showed a key operation in slot PS4. That slot was documented as empty and had no physical key card assigned. Staff documented the reserve zone effect independently of the primary software. The root authority file added photographs, mechanical indicators, and passive records because software agreement alone was insufficient. Exhibit 7 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror, before it entered the final record. For root authority, archive staff searched maintenance files, procurement ledgers, and retired procedures. A 1989 continuity memo proposed a reserve namespace that could preserve service identity when normal providers were destroyed. The proposal was marked not implemented. The reserve zone reference predated the active equipment and was absent from routine training. The archived reserve zone copy carried custody marks from before the current staff, vendor, and control system existed. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The reserve zone anomaly returned under a repeatable condition. The zone appeared only when a service failed both primary and contractual backup checks. It disappeared after ordinary routing recovered. The regularity of root authority allowed deliberate testing and made random noise progressively less credible. Each recurrence of root authority preserved the same order, while environmental conditions changed around it. In root authority, an independent review reproduced the result documented under recurrence pattern without using the operational interface. A full isolation was performed for root authority. The mirror was disconnected from every upstream and booted from verified media. Queries for tidy reserve still resolved from an empty cache. The reserve zone reading survived removal of the systems most likely to generate, replay, or relay it. Isolation in the reserve zone removed network input, automatic repair, remote support, and every scheduled process. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous isolation test value, separating absence from disagreement. Evidence outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror changed the scale of root authority. Root authority. An air-gapped disaster recovery exercise at a government site received the same zone through a resolver with no physical connection to the exchange. The external reserve zone record had been preserved before investigators disclosed their own result. External evidence for root authority arrived with its own timestamps and chain of custody, not as a reconstruction. Exhibit 11 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror before it entered the final record. The root authority team examined physical samples and passive records next Outage. Forensic copies of the zone contained valid serials, certificate chains, and service metadata assembled from many agencies, but no creation timestamp. The reserve zone findings confirmed an effect without identifying an ordinary transfer of matter or energy. Control samples in the reserve zone were handled beside the affected material to compare contamination and storage directly. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The reserve zone anomaly then affected operations rather than observation alone. The reserve endpoints kept emergency services online. Staff could not shut them down without causing the outage the unauthorized system was preventing. In root authority, staff had to choose between an impossible measurement and the public function built around it. By this stage of root authority, ignoring the reading carried a measurable operational cost. In root authority, an independent review reproduced the result documented under operational consequence without using the operational interface. Containment for root authority was attempted under written order. The team blocked Outage. Reserve responses. Client machines began reaching the same servers by raw addresses learned from no visible configuration source. The reserve zone response suggested recognition of system function rather than attachment to one original device. The reserve zone containment order defined success before execution. The system met the restriction by moving the effect. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous containment order value, separating absence from disagreement. Analysts reviewing root authority compared raw signals, derived values, and each software decision. Packet captures showed ordinary DNS traffic. The anomaly was authority. Systems accepted an unsigned history, as if it had always belonged to the root. The precision in the reserve zone resembled a standard more than an uncontrolled malfunction. The root authority reviews separated what sensors observed from what software inferred, because those layers changed differently. Exhibit 15 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror before it entered the final record. The strongest conventional explanation for root authority was tested directly. A hidden national network was considered. Several reserve endpoints were blank commodity servers that acquired correct applications only after resolution. The proposed explanation in the reserve zone file failed against independent instruments and custody records. Investigators retained the rejected reserve zone explanation, including the strongest evidence that first supported it. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The oldest file relevant to root authority belonged to an emergency standards project. PS4 allowed continuity systems to accept a service identity when 3 independent records agreed on its function, even if the original host was gone. The reserve zone document placed continuity of measurement above custody of a particular device. PS4 first appears in root authority as authority for accepting a reference, not as a device serial. In root authority, an independent review reproduced the result documented under historical project without using the operational interface. The first controlled root authority test changed one variable and registered every expected outcome in advance. Engineers created a false failed service. The reserve zone ignored it because no public dependency existed. The reserve zone anomaly followed the formal condition rather than incidental activity. The first reserve zone test changed one registered variable while passive controls remained outside the procedure. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous controlled test of value, separating absence from disagreement. A second reserve zone test removed the assumption used in the first. They took a real low-risk service offline. Within 80 seconds, Reserve assigned its name to an unused server and reconstructed the current database. The second result in root authority narrowed the mechanism, while making the physical evidence harder to explain. The second root authority test removed formal recognition from one object and applied it to another. Exhibit 19 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror, before it entered the final record. The root authority event escalated before testing could be closed. A compromised test server was deliberately marked untrusted. The reserve authority removed it and reassigned the service before security tools completed their scan. From that point, the reserve zone no longer fit the category of calibration irregularity. Emergency limits were crossed during the reserve zone, forcing containment to take priority over additional measurement. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. A separate system then reproduced or accepted the reserve zone condition. Certificate monitors, routers, and client trust stores all accepted the new endpoint without receiving conventional updates. The connection in root authority was procedural and documentary. No normal data path accounted for it. The second institution in root authority had not received case details, ruling out instructed behavior. In root authority, an independent review reproduced the result documented under cross-system event without using the operational interface. An independent audit reconstructed root authority from original media title. No source repository, signing ceremony, or operator account could be tied to the zone. The unknown key existed only while it was needed. The reserve zone audit found no single fraud, hidden device, or common component capable of producing every observation. Auditors rebuilt the reserve zone from original media and physically inspected every component named in the explanation. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous independent audit value, separating absence from disagreement. The review of root authority identified one consistent mechanism. The reserve system separated service identity from hardware. Once measurements agreed that a function was required, PS4 made a replacement authoritative. The mechanism explained acceptance in the reserve zone without explaining the first impossible reading. The root authority mechanism accounts for authority and propagation, but not the first anomalous input. Exhibit 23 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror, before it entered the final record. The final root authority experiment removed the remaining ordinary inputs. The mirror was powered down and its disks removed. A laptop connected to a passive switch still resolved one name, root authority.reserve. Outside staff witnessed the final reserve zone test and preserved its result on passive media. The final reserve zone test used passive evidence so an affected computer could not create the only record. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The formal finding in root authority was limited but specific. The address belonged to the laptop itself. A local process appeared, served the correct root data, and terminated when the network recovered. Investigators described the reserve zone chain of acceptance more confidently than the phenomenon's origin. After root authority, the institution changed procedure. The exchange prohibited .wa reserve in production and built conventional offline recovery images for every critical service found in the zone. The reserve zone correction reduced immediate risk while removing a capability operators had begun to depend on. The corrective action after the reserve zone was tested against normal operation before staff accepted the lost capability. The root authority file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous institutional response value, separating absence from disagreement. One trace of the reserve zone remained after closure. During major outages, some consumer routers still log successful reserve answers. Their manufacturers deny implementing the domain. The remaining trace from root authority has not been reconciled with the official finding. Residual evidence from root authority was photographed and sealed after the main systems were removed from service. Exhibit 27 was checked against a control held outside National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror, before it entered the final record. Current procedure at National Internet Exchange, sovereign DNS root mirror reflects the unresolved status of root authority. Root operators now preserve memory images and hardware module state before restarting any mirror that serves an unrecognized delegation. For the reserve zone, the purpose is to preserve raw disagreement before automation turns it into consensus. The revised reserve zone procedure requires disagreement to remain visible until a human review documents a choice. For the reserve zone, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The final reserve zone record states, .reserve is not registered. It has no operator and no published key. During an outage, it is still authoritative. The case documented as root authority is closed for operation and remains open for measurement.